Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We're talking more about the 1920s, and in this lecture, continuing our discussion of the economic prosperity of the 20s and how it contributes to the possibility of a soaring decade like the Roaring Twenties. In the previous lecture, we talked about the automobile industry and some of the after effects of World War I in the prosperity of American business in general. But there are many other factors that went into the prosperity of the 1920s. One of which was the increasing availability of credit and installment buying. For most of our nation's history up to this point, the belief was if you couldn't afford to purchase something with the cash or gold or money that you had in your pocket, then you shouldn't be able to buy it at all. So there really was not much in the way of credit. But as the number of big ticket items increased in the country in the 1920s, in order to sell those kind of items and make the purchase of them easier, businesses needed to extend more credit. So when you think about even today, when you purchase a car, oftentimes you get a car loan and make payments to purchase that car. Almost nobody these days purchases a house with cash. You take out a mortgage and make monthly payments. Even items like refrigerators and appliances sometimes are purchased with credit. And so that's the sort of thing that was coming on in the 1920s. And as more and more businesses and more banks were willing to extend purchasers credit, they were able to sell more and more of those goods. We're going to talk more about credit as a feature of this economy just a little bit later in this lecture. Similarly, the stock market itself fueled the prosperity of the 1920s. And we'll talk much more about the nature of the 1920s stock market when we get to the end of this decade and we talk about the stock market crash. But the stock market, of course, is one measure of how the economy is doing. And as the stock market goes up and more Americans are making money from the stock market, they were able to make more purchases, and that fueled the continued growth of the economy. And so, in a sense, the soaring stock market was fun while it lasted, and it contributed to the ability of many people to purchase many things in the 1920s. Of course, it all comes crashing down at the end of the decade. We'll talk much more about that later. So what was the government doing to support these kind of policies? Well, we already talked about the presidency of Calvin Coolidge in a previous lecture. And he did some things as president that promoted the prosperity that comes in this decade, encouraging the trickle-down economic philosophy, which we talked about previously. He also signed a number of tax reductions during his presidency, most of them assisting the wealthy, again with this kind of trickle-down idea. He encouraged tax breaks for big business and discouraged the prosecution of monopolies. So again, all of this helps big business, and the idea being that this is going to trickle down. He also vetoed several times during his presidency the extension of aid to farmers, the poor, and veterans. I mentioned previously that the bonus bill for veterans of World War I eventually passed over his veto, and we're going to come back to that a good bit later in the semester. Some credit also goes to the Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, who carried out endless studies of efficiency. And he also encouraged public works at the local and state level. And again, we're going to be talking much more about Hoover when we get to the Great Depression. Of course, he is president as the nation sinks into the Great Depression. And as historians have noted many times, it's one of the great ironies of this period that Hoover is thought to have done so much to help the economy when it was booming in the 1920s, and then appeared utterly helpless as the economy sank during the Great Depression. So we'll talk more about Hoover when we get to the Depression, but in the 20s as Secretary of Commerce, he actually did aid the growth of the economy. The soaring economy also brought new industries to prominence. In the 1920s, industries of the old economy, such as textiles, railroads, coal, lumber, and meat packing, began to decline, while new consumer industries like the automobile, entertainment, processed food, ready-made clothing, and home appliances flourished. Urbanization and a rise in private home ownership also led to further increases in needs around the home, in particular the appliances. Think about homes needing refrigerators and washers and dryers. So with the building of new homes and the purchase of new homes comes even more purchase of those kind of appliances. We should also note that not all Americans or all sectors benefited from the so-called prosperity of the 1920s. As I've already mentioned previously, but will remind you again, farmers in particular struggled after a brief post-war boom, and farmers make up nearly half of the country's population, even at this time. Manufacturing and mining also declined somewhat. So the prosperity also benefited the wealthy more than the working classes. Corporate profits soared, and the number of millionaires more than tripled during the decade. And as I've mentioned, the soaring stock market, of course, benefits those who own stocks, which even at the very height of the stock market boom in the 20s was only about 10% of the nation's population. Wages for workers did increase during this period, but only slightly. In 1929, the top 36,000 Americans in terms of wealth controlled as much wealth as the 12 million poorest citizens. So much of the wealth, which was generated by stocks, bonds, and real estate, accrued for those who started the era with some measure of wealth. It is certainly a story of the rich getting richer. But the prosperity did seem to trickle down, and average Americans were doing better and had more than they had in previous eras. And part of this was due, as I mentioned previously, to the increased availability of credit. About half of all Americans own their own homes by the end of the 1920s. And credit was available in many different forms during this time. Banks were loaning out money, and as we'll discuss later, they were increasingly free in their policies about loaning out money. There were few regulations. They also gave out low-interest mortgages. And margin lending, which we'll discuss again later. This is the process of loaning people money for the purpose of investing it in the stock market. If the stock market goes up when you're doing that, obviously this is an easy way to make money where you didn't have any before. It's when the stock market goes down that this can be problematic, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the stock market crash. Unions and companies could also loan money to their workers, and in some cases, department stores would loan money or allow people to make purchases on layaway or by making payments. And in fact, it's in this era that we see the creation of the first credit card, the Diners Club card. I would emphasize that credit cards do not become very widespread at this time, and it would be a stretch to say that many Americans suffered with credit card debt. But we do start to see the extension of such debt during this time. Business itself grew hand in hand with advertising and publicity. Advertising became a major industry in its own right. Companies were learning how to pressure consumers and convince them that they needed a particular product. Advertising increased and improved dramatically over the course of the decade. By 1927, advertising was $1.5 billion a year business. The new brand of advertising focused less on the special qualities of a given product and more on the disastrous results that a consumer might suffer from not buying it. There was a focus on the desires of humans, the desire to be rich, the desire to fit in, and so on. Successful advertising campaigns convinced consumers that they couldn't afford not to buy their product. The embarrassing discolorations in clothing from using the wrong detergent, the embarrassing smells from using the wrong soap or deodorant, and so on. Advertisers also benefited from the creation and growing numbers of superstars from sports and screen, which we will be talking about in future lectures. Famous actors and athletes are becoming endorsers of products, and consumers want to buy the products that these famous people were using and encourage them to use. One of the most famous advertising campaigns of that era was for Listerine, the mouthwash. The campaigns explained halitosis and the horrible results that might come from it. These are some of the lines from Listerine advertisements of that day. Often a bridesmaid, but never a bride. Edna's case really was a pathetic one. Why did she leave him that way? And that's why you're a failure. So, for those who chose not to use Listerine, the results could be disastrous in your life, as your spouse might leave you and success might not come your way. Listerine swept to greater and greater profits as the decade wore on, thanks to this brilliant advertising campaign. And just as a final note, I would emphasize, no one really knows whether Listerine was actually any better than any of their competitor products, but this advertising campaign convinced Americans to buy that product as opposed to others. The prosperity fueled itself as other industries were created. There was a proliferation of self-help books and books of etiquette and instruction manuals on how to get rich quick. Beauty magazines and gossip magazines filled the shelves in stores and bookshops. Ultimately, such vehicles spread the trends and businesses to all reaches of the country, and urban trends were picked up in the countryside as well. As Calvin Coolidge, the president, famously said, the chief business of America is business. So business itself was becoming a business. Colleges created business programs and business schools. Service clubs, such as the Rotary Club, Kiwanis Club, and Lions Clubs, soared in membership, gathering to hear speeches about business and how to become successful. One trend in such literature and speeches was the association of religion with business. Biblical lessons were applied to business ad nauseum. To the traveling salesman, for instance, one might quote Matthew chapter 7, verse 7. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you. The Metropolitan Casualty Insurance Company released a pamphlet titled Moses, Persuader of Men, saying that Moses was one of the greatest salesmen and real estate promoters that ever lived. The most famous example of this, to be sure, was a book by Bruce Barton called The Man Nobody Knows, the top-selling nonfiction book in 1925 and 1926. In his book, Barton draws analogies between Christianity and Jesus Christ and business and leading businessmen. Barton explained, Jesus was the most popular dinner guest in Jerusalem. He was an outdoor man and a great executive. Barton wrote, he picked up 12 men from the bottom ranks of business and forged them into an organization that conquered the world. Nowhere is there such a startling example of executive success as the way in which that organization was brought together. Barton also wrote about the parables, describing them as the most powerful advertisements of all time. He would be a national advertiser today. In our next lecture, we'll talk about some of the other features in the 1920s that made the era known as the Roaring Twenties possible.